Anyway, I'll refer to Ashley.
So I'm going to kind of give a little bit of an overview of what medicine is like in the United States versus Minnesota versus Koochiching County. So medical care overall in the United States at the turn of the century is still really super basic. We're talking about people who are trying to combine home remedies with a little bit of science and a lot of quackery. But then some basic elements of modern medicine, like hospitals, trained physicians that actually have a degree, and extensive medical research, that stuff just doesn't exist in the 19th century at all. However, at the turn of the century, the public and private sector is really starting to push for better medical care. So they were designing practices that were going to improve public health care. Governments were initiating programs that were going to give them better water quality because they started to figure out that, hey, we probably shouldn't be drinking water where we're dumping our sewage or where we're dumping our refuse, because it was giving people cholera, people were having typhoid problems. Vaccinations were also increasingly employed as a means to stop diseases amongst Americans. And some other things that were coming into play was the use of chloroform during surgery. They realized that, hey, if we huff this and knock people out, we can perform surgeries on people. And this happens in the 1840s, and of course the discovery of x-rays in 1895. So what does this mean for Minnesota overall as a state? Minnesota is not recognized as a territory until 1849, and then of course we become a state in 1858. But we have our first practicing doctor in 1841. And when I mean like a practicing doctor, I don't mean just someone who maybe is, a native doctor or someone who says that they're a doctor. This is someone who actually went to college, received a degree, and kind of at this point knows what they're doing. Antiseptic surgery does not reach Minnesota until the 1880s, despite being used during the 1860s. The first person in Minnesota that uses antiseptic treatments is a doctor that actually frequented Rainy Lake. And his name may be familiar to you. His name was Dr. Frederick Dunsmore. He performed a surgery on a young woman where he removed a very large ovarian tumor in 1882. And so he was able to use those antiseptic procedures, and she was able to survive that procedure. Minnesota is also very preoccupied at the time with controlling diseases amongst lumberjacks, particularly smallpox. They are pushing for smallpox vaccines, but people were very concerned about vaccinations. They thought that they were dangerous, that they were going to be getting the disease from the vaccine. Lumber camps said, absolutely not, we're not going to vaccinate our lumberjacks at all. Well, hindsight says that they probably should have done that because we had smallpox epidemics up here amongst the lumber camps and a lot of people died. So what does that mean for Koochiching County healthcare? Koochiching County doesn't receive its first doctor until 1903 when Dr. M.E. Withrow arrives. And he comes here via Winnipeg. He arrives on a train, and he actually stays over in Fort Francis because when he gets here, he's told that Koochiching is not exactly a very accommodating place. We don't have very nice accommodations. We're kind of a dump. And this is the village of Koochiching, mind you, not just the county as a whole. And so he stays at the Hotel Alberton, and then he comes across, and he finds out that we're very much a Wild West town, and he finds it to be very agreeable, and he decides to stay. For many years, he has several roles. He acts as the Assistant Surgeon of the United States Public Health Service. He serves in the U.S. Army. And he also carries on his own private practice, and he serves as the mayor for 2 terms. Another gentleman that comes into play is Dr. George Swinnerton. He arrives in International Falls from North Home in 1907, and he acts as the county health official. And he shares this role with Dr. Withrow for a short time. And I think eventually he takes on this role fully for himself. And he is quite blunt. He writes a lot of articles in the newspaper. He's not afraid to tell people during times of epidemic, particularly when the influenza epidemic of 1918 comes about, that his friends and neighbors are truly a part of the problem. Like, if you're sick, you know, he would write, if you're sick, please stay home. You are literally killing your friends and neighbors, your children, your postman, by going out into public. He was a huge supporter of vaccinations, and he had absolutely no problem, calling people out for bad behavior when it came to healthcare. The Minnesota State Board of Health sang praises of Koochiching County, stating that Koochiching in the state of Minnesota had the very best healthcare system in the state, thanks to this gentleman. He teamed up with Doc Withrow in 1910 to push for purified water in the city. The city fathers team, they petitioned, created a contract with the Minnesota and Ontario Power Company to have water provided for the city. Well, that contract did not state that they had to provide them pure drinking water. And so all of these people started getting sick with typhoid, and M&O did not care. They tried to come back and say to the company, like, hey, you have to provide us with clean drinking water. And they were like, no, that's not in the deal. So the city ended up having to come up with the funding to create a way to purify the system so the citizens of International Falls weren't going to be sick. So they heavily advocated to help make sure that these people had proper sanitation of water and good sewer as well. That was installed in the city to help alleviate those issues. Do you want me to move into the flu epidemic? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're gonna move into the flu pandemic. The influenza pandemic of 1918 was the deadliest pandemic that ever in history. And it infected an estimated 500 million people, and at that time that was the equivalent of 1/3 of the world's population. It killed an estimated 20 to 50 million people, including roughly 675,000 Americans. It was first observed in Europe, and then it spread to America, and then it slowly started kind of moving across other areas like Asia and things like that. There were no effective drugs or vaccines that could fight this flu. They did develop a vaccine in 1918 for the flu, but what they were targeting was a bacteria. They didn't understand that the flu was a virus. So they were just injecting these people with different types of bacteria, and it was basically, it did nothing for them. There were 4 waves of the flu. The first wave of the flu happens in spring of 1918, and that flu really isn't that deadly. People are getting fever, chills, might be vomiting, but then they get better within a few days. The second wave comes in the fall, and people were contracting the illness, and then they would die within just a few hours. I mean, you could get it and you're dead 10 hours later. Some people would just die within a matter of a few days. The very first flu vaccination was not actually developed. The first one that was effective was not developed until 1938. It was developed by Jonas Salk, and he was the same gentleman that developed later on the polio vaccine. This flu had a lot of impacts, particularly during World War I. what I found interesting was that this flu killed more U.S. soldiers than what died in battle during war. It was easily spread amongst military members, especially those in the Navy. You have a lot of men just sitting on a boat. I mean, they're in like a giant tuna can in the ocean, just contracting disease, and they can easily spread it. So there was a lot of campaigns like don't spit on the boat, don't spit anywhere, don't sneeze on your neighbor, don't touch them, don't shake their hands. And the war made it very difficult to try to fight it because there was a huge shortage of physicians because everyone was fighting the war effort. In Koochiching County, all of the schools were closed, businesses were closed, the district court was closed, there were no church activities. If you go through the paper, the entire county is just completely shut down. This is where George Swinnerton kind of comes in and he's like, you guys, stay home if you're sick. You're killing everybody. You're killing the economy. No one can go anywhere. No one can do anything. We have 60 plus cases, developing every week. Like, just stop. Stop moving around. Stop talking to people. Don't talk to your neighbors. Stay home. The third floor of the Northern Minnesota Hospital was converted into a flu ward. They were completely overwhelmed, so that a lot of other places, private homes, were becoming hospitals. The local Red Cross was busy handing out flu masks and other medical supplies. And a lot of the deaths that were reported in Koochiching County that came from this influenza pandemic weren't always necessarily from the flu, but they were from secondary infection, like they would develop pneumonia or something like that. But by the summer of 1919, the pandemic started to kind of come to an end. And that was basically because either everyone was dead or these people had developed some kind of immunity to it. They were able to fight it off and they were able to survive. So.
I mentioned earlier that
You good?
I mentioned earlier that the only hospital in the area around the turn of the century is the one in Fort Francis. One reference that I found included that they treated gunshot wounds from two victims from Rainy Lake City, Bill Randolph and Boston O'Brien. Both of them survived because of treatment in Fort Francis. But because there were so few hospitals and so few doctors, so many people relied upon either leaving the area for health care or home remedies. Or Alexander Baker, all of us know him, cut his foot with an axe so severely that infection set in. And he and his wife were actually going to go as far as Duluth to look for treatment. But he was intercepted by an Indian couple who convinced him to stay. And they had their dog, HNS had their dog, lick the wound on Alexander Baker's foot, lick it kind of clean, and then Indian would cover it with lard. And how many times he did this treatment to Baker's foot, I don't know. But the disease or the infection completely went away, and he suffered no ill effects. Kind of an amazing story. But the hardships, experienced by the pioneers were compounded by the lack of accessibility to any health care. Below zero temperatures, deep snow, muddy roads, swollen rivers, all added to the difficulty of getting help. You add the lack of knowledge and the fear of the cost of medical expenses because they were poor people. It even got worse. Home cures and the assistance of neighbors to treat anything was very helpful. Jeannie Erickson here in Rainier recalled using a white powder called iodofoam. I believe that's how you say it. It would be poured directly onto open wounds caused by saws and axes. She said that it smelled terrible. It was very effective, and because it contains iodine, it's in use today. I looked it up on the internet, and it said it is used today. But the role of midwives cannot be underestimated. There are quite a few stories, and I'm just going to tell a couple here. Jeannie Rasmussen lost her mom at a young age. I think she was 12, and had to quit school to help at home and then help at the neighbors. And she gained some experience with newborns, and soon was called upon to assist in deliveries. And as a midwife, she brought 12 little ones into the world. There's another story I find somewhat humorous. The Hofdahl family had 12 children, and all of them were born at home. Grandma Sylvia was always present, and then had the assistance of the father of the family during the birth. But the baby was born and handed to a rather young older sister. Another sister, young sister, became very upset because she believed it was her turn to hold the little one, and she began to raise quite a fit, I guess. But then the father said, "Wait a minute, I'll get another one." That was the first indication that there were twins coming. But as Ashley said, it was not until 1903 that Koochiching got his first real doctor. Dr. Emmy Withrow arrived, and he had a large area covered. He had Lake Kabetogama to the east, Little Fork to the south, Roman to the west. In 1907, the newly formed Koochiching County still had no hospital, but the county board paid $213.74 to build a facility to harbor some of the ill people, and oddly enough, it was called not a hospital, but a pest house. Where they come up with that, I don't know. The times now began to change rapidly. 1990, E.W. Backus plans for dams, paper mills, sawmills were well underway. Doctors Robert and Elizabeth Monahan and B.F. Osborne moved from Black Duck to the Falls and were given a contract to care for Minnesota and Ontario Power Company employees. On August 3rd, 1909, ground was broken at the corner of 2nd Street and 8th Avenue for a 25-bed hospital. Naturally, it was called the M&O Hospital, but not for Backus. The M was for Monahan, and the O was for Osborne. They were soon joined later in 1909 by Doctors Frederick and Mary Ghostly. February 26, 1910, the Northern Minnesota Hospital Association was formed. It included the Monahans, Ghostleys, Dr. Osborne, Claire C. Craig, I remember him, and James Reed. They had actually 3 hospitals, one in International Falls, one in Black Duck, one in Crosby, and eventually built another one in Tower. 1921, Dr. William F. Cantwell. I don't really remember him. I remember the name so well, but he began practice in Little Fork. 2 years later, moved to International Falls. 1933, Dr. Ralph Hanover and his wife Effie arrived to practice in Little Fork, and in 1936, built an 8-bed hospital. It was later expanded to 22 beds in 1951. But any of you remember house calls? I do. I know Bobby probably does too. The doctors back in those days often went through lengthy, arduous trips to fix those, help those afflicted due to poor roads, bad weather. Mary Ghostly wrote of one trip that she had to go to fix a little one at Kettle Falls. She had to take the train to Cousin, take a logging train to Hoist Bay on Namakan Lake, and then take a boat to Oliver Knox's cabin on Rainy Lakeside of Kettle Falls, all to fix little Mary Knox's case of severe tonsillitis. It's also mentioned in my research quite often that the doctors actually were not paid for a lot of the stuff that they did due to the destitution of the clients. 1948, a new hospital was completed in International Falls, just west of M&O Insulate plant. And of those doctors, I personally remember Dr. Craig. He delivered me on this. Dr. Will, anybody remember Dr. Will? Dr. Tolstos does it. And Dr. Walter, of course. I knew Fred very well. But times have changed so much. If we're have a serious illness or injury, a phone call is made, EMTs arrive in minutes, and we get to doctors and hospitals. However, we do put ourselves in harm's way. Now and then it could be a lot like the old days. Hunting, fishing, snowmobiling, ATVing in rural areas with no cell phone service makes any accident or illness potentially a lot more serious. That's why I always recommend to people, if you're going to be out and about, carry a complete first aid kit. And if you possibly can, take classes in first aid and CPR. Might save a life. But I can take a break now for Burn.
For me,
For you.
you gotta let it, is it on?
Yep.
Dr. Roger McDonald was a general practitioner who practiced in Koochiching County in northern Minnesota during the last half of the 20th century. Besides his medical skills, he had given the gift of his writing about his experiences. I strongly recommend his first two books, The Country Doctor's Casebook and The Country Doctor's Chronicles, both of which are available for sale at the library, at the museum. In the foreword to The Country Doctor's Casebook, Dr. Roger Welch wrote, "What exactly is history? 100 years ago, before World War II, before Dad? That may seem like trivial, even silly question, and yet it's one that is worth considering simply because as we think about it, the fact of the matter is history is right now. It is happening at this very moment, not just to important people, but to you and people like you. Roger McDonald knows this. He has had the wisdom to realize that his own work in Minnesota as a rural doctor constitutes not only history, but important history, and more significantly, interesting history. But even better, Dr. McDonald has been generous enough to write down and share these histories with us. McDonald provides us a unique view of people we might otherwise meet in the pages of history. For one thing, everyone eventually needs medical attention. Dr. McDonald's experience covers the full range of humanity. Moreover, he constitutes an educated, insightful element within his geography, just as any doctor does. But to our good fortune is that an unusually articulate narrator and sensitive observer. His stories are not just interesting, but real to read, but moving, sometimes hilarious, often with a reflection on a range of human experience. Those are books where he talks about everything from appendicitis to murder and suicide and anything that could go wrong with human beings.